What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and for today's video we'll be having a bit more of just a talk than normal. It'll still be informative, I hope, but it's about a part of the game that I'm very much a fan of that has been changed a bit going into Shadowlands. Today we'll be talking about Mythic Plus and some of the changes coming with it. Okay, so this video is still going to be informative-ish, if you haven't been keeping up with what Blizzard's choices have been lately in regards to Mythic Plus, but it'll mostly just be my opinion of these choices, so please bear that in mind, and don't feel like you can't have a different opinion than I do on this topic. Whether you agree or disagree, feel free to comment below, but as I try to emphasize with these sorts of videos since I don't do them that often, just be considerate of one another if you feel differently about this topic than someone else. I thankfully have only had to delete a handful of comments on the channel in the past, so I just want y'all to be courteous to one another, and I'm sure my regular viewers shouldn't have any issues with this little forewarning. Anyways, Mythic Plus, and some of the changes that are going on. I'll start with just telling you all the two big changes that have been made, and then go into my thoughts on them if you don't want to listen to me blab. So, number 1. The drop rate of Mythic Keystone loot is going to be 1 piece of loot in Shadowlands. And 2. The highest gear attainable from the end of a dungeon in Season 1 of Shadowlands Mythic Plus is going to be 210 item level from a plus 15 dungeon, at least as of now. This puts it 3 item levels lower than most of the heroic drop from Castle Nathria, and 10 item levels lower than the last 2 bosses from the raid. Even with the nerf to the end of dungeon item level rewards from Mythic Plus Keystones, as long as you're able to do a 15 on a consistent basis, you will still be able to have a pretty high item level set of gear, so that is something to remember. It'll just take longer than someone who raids Mythic on a very consistent basis, which is part of the appeal to the weekly cache, as it lets people get some of the higher level gear while not being able to get it quite as quickly as someone who puts in the time in a full Mythic raid team. I added this little part in after I was mostly done with the video, mainly because I referred a lot to heroic raiding and didn't really brush up much on the topic of Mythic raiding, so I just wanted to clear the air about that aspect. I'll start with the change we've known about the longest, but I haven't brought up in any prior videos. Blizzard has decided to dramatically reduce the drop rate of gear from Mythic Plus. This was something Ian had mentioned in an interview a while back, and it honestly doesn't surprise me too much that this has happened. Mythic Plus for most players is mathematically the fastest way to get geared up quickly. Dungeons generally take between 25 to 40 minutes to complete, and in patch 8.3 at least, numerous pieces of gear drop. This of course meant that armor stacking, or intentionally bringing as many classes of the same armor type, was a popular way to funnel upgrades and gear to either a friend's alt or a prospective buyer of a Mythic Plus boosting run. Boosting runs have all but taken over most of trade chat regardless of the server. Somewhere like Area 52, for instance, is often just a stream of boosting services of many types. These services can range from Mythic Plus, Horrific Visions, raiding, and even PvP carries. However, probably the worst offender of all of these is Mythic Plus, where you'll find dozens of groups in Group Finder just trying to sell keys, and the aforementioned trade chat spam as well. So with the base drop amount for Mythic Plus going to a singular piece of loot, what does this mean for the gearing process, at least in my opinion? For a lot of people that are used to the amount of loot that you get from dungeons right now, this might seem like a absolutely horrible change, as you're literally spending time with even higher chance of not getting any loot at all in Shadowlands, which, yes, is entirely possible. However, I'm the type of person who prefers Mythic Plus over raiding regardless of how much loot I get, although I do participate in Mythic and Heroic raid content simply because there are oftentimes best-in-slot items that only come from raiding, such as trinkets. So for me personally, the reduction in drop rate doesn't really change my outlook on Mythic Plus. I've honestly never been an exceptionally lucky person when it comes to getting loot from dungeons anyhow, so I haven't been that devastated in Shadowlands over it either. If I were to be devil's advocate with this, you could say Blizzard is just intentionally slowing down the gearing process to keep people subbed longer or something along those lines. However, I disagree at least a little. With how much gear literally gets thrown at you in Battle for Azeroth with no real upgrades ever, I just have bags and banks full of epic items that really don't impress me as much as they used to. Besides, most of my gear upgrades come from my end of week Mythic Plus chest anyhow, even when I'm only moderately geared out, as I just have some really bad luck with Mythic Plus drop rates. Doing numerous Mythic Plus dungeons with literally no upgrades in sight can be a bit frustrating, however it does make any upgrades that you do get slightly more rewarding feeling to a degree. I don't foresee this affecting Mythic Plus sales that much, unfortunately, cause one way or another you're still gonna earn a Mythic level piece of gear from your weekly cash, whether you pay for 1 dungeon, or 5 dungeons, or 10 dungeons. This brings me to my next Mythic Plus topic, and it's one that has more recently come to the surface. Mythic Plus gear is going to cap out below Heroic raid gear. To be exact, the end of dungeon gear reward from a plus 15 Mythic Keystone will cap out at 210 item level, whereas 213 is the item level from Heroic Castle Nathria, with the last 2 bosses dropping item level 220 gear. While Blizzard doesn't do this in every single raid that comes out, there are often times where the last boss or 2 will drop higher item level gear. This does make sense in my opinion, as generally your last boss or last couple bosses require pretty good amounts of coordination. However, with Mythic Plus already dropping far less loot than before, I really don't see a need to make the loot worth less than a perceivably base difficulty boss in Heroic. Being less than the last 2 is again fine in my opinion, as even our Mythic Plus reward cache maxes out at the base Mythic raid level, leaving a noticeable item level gap compared to those who are able to complete the last 2 bosses on Mythic difficulty. Without touching those last 2 bosses on Mythic Castle Nathria, it is literally impossible for someone who only plays Mythic Plus at the highest reward level possible to outgear a raider who is doing the same thing. And again, I understand why that's the case. I will say though that unless there is an exceptional difference in our performance levels going into Season 1 of Shadowlands for Mythic Plus, I'll be curious to see exactly how many people are completing Mythic Plus 15 dungeons on the first week that they're available. As anyone who does a reasonable amount of Mythic Plus spamming will understand, yes, it is repeatable content, and the reward is being weighed on repeatability versus a raid lockout. The way I see raiding though is that a raid boss has an exponential decay of difficulty before you're rewarded with a high item level piece of loot. What I mean by that is this. Raid bosses have a variety of mechanics. They require various amounts of coordination and communication based on how difficult the boss encounter is. An unexperienced group going into a heroic raid boss can easily wipe a dozen times in the first minute of an encounter just by not understanding the mechanics and how to deal with them. However, every pull in a raid, with a structured group at least, gets easier. The more you get to see of the fight, and the more you repeat the fight, the more people learn and the easier the fight gets. Eventually, you lower that difficulty curve to the point where your skill is higher than the difficulty, and that's when you win the encounter and get your loot. Once this happens, the end result is easily repeatable in mere minutes eventually. A Mythic Plus dungeon also has a lot of mechanics to deal with, and there are various Mythic Plus dungeons out there. However, instead of the dungeons getting easier the more you do them, the damage and healing requirements scale up with you as you do higher level keys, even of the same dungeon. Affixes also change every week, and with them, routes or just the way you deal with a dungeon changes too. Eventually, reaching the point of getting a single piece of less than base level heroic raid gear can take potentially hours with a variety of dungeons, and the difficulty is even higher than the last dungeons you were dealing with. That is honestly a lot of the appeal to Mythic Plus in my opinion, as the challenge always grows. However, with a heroic raid, the challenge actually goes down the more you do it, cause the fight never changes. It's choreographed the same way every time. Other than when some encounters have mechanics that automatically select their target, but that also happens in dungeons as well. The difference to me between the two forms of content is there is some level of stagnation with dungeons. While raids are cycled out every 6 to 7 months or so, dungeons are recycled for literally 2 years of consistent usage, with only seasonal affixes really being brought in to help differentiate them when the raids change. Because of this, dungeons will become progressively easier over the course of the expansion due to sheer repetition, much like how raiding does every time you do a certain boss fight. Raiding, however, does gain some level of freshness every time a new raid is released, which quickly turns into the same sort of stagnation that dungeons suffer from, though on a much shorter timetable. To be fair, there are often dungeons added partway through an expansion to help liven up the pool of options to a degree. Something I feel people often succumb to is using end of expansion power levels and familiarity with dungeons to say that they are easier than a heroic raid boss. Yes, after 2 years of doing literally the same dungeons, they become basically muscle memory, which does affect the perceived challenge they offer. Blizzard does also increase the base scaling of dungeons as the expansions progress though, so it's not quite as simple as the dungeon just staying the same challenge the entire way through. Once we have dozens of best-in-slot, socketed, corrupted, best-in-slot trinkets, and all sorts of other crazy stuff like we do right now in patch 8.3, yes, a 15 becomes pretty darn easy for a lot of people. The same can be said of raids, however. With the new drop rate changes for Mythic Plus and Shadowlands, it would take an exceptional amount of plus 15 dungeons to equal the amount of loot you'd earn from a single heroic raid run, and for a lesser item level at that. However, while I'm not a big fan of these changes, I can see some of the rationale behind them. I'm still not too keen on the idea of putting two forms of PvE content at odds against one another, though regardless, I know I'll be doing both raiding and Mythic Plus simply because I enjoy both forms of content, and raids often have exceptionally good trinkets anyhow, so yeah, that doesn't hurt either. I also kinda sorta feel that they're intentionally gonna keep Mythic Plus loot reward levels below heroic raids so that whenever Race for World Firsts occur, it won't be steamrolled because of people being able to trade heroic raid gear the second they walk in. Though that might just be my inner conspiracy theorist kicking in, I don't know. Anyways, I know this was a bit different than my normal videos, as I generally try to avoid these really opinionated things like this particular topic, but it's something that has been bugging me for a while. I try to see things from both perspectives as much as I can. However, as someone who spends much more of my time on Mythic Plus than raiding, it does feel to a degree that the form of content that I prefer isn't being given the level of merit that it deserves in some cases. Honestly, I could probably go even further into this topic, but I think that's enough for one day. I plan on getting back on the informative videos after this one, but let me know in the comments one way or another if you like these sort of videos too. If you're new around to my little corner of the YouTube algorithm, I'd like to welcome you to check out some of my other videos. I do new uploads every weekday on a variety of WoW related things, mainly overviews and informational type stuff, with an occasional video like this and a whole lot of rogue specific stuff. As always, I just wanted to say how much I truly appreciate all my regular viewers, subscribers, and especially my patrons for helping make these Sheba shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.